Great, thank you, Gail. And I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative to, Gail, ask you if you would, in just brief detail, talk a little bit more about comments you had made about CLIA, FDA purview, and HIPAA at the beginning of your remarks.
Sure. And you know, let me caveat this by saying I do not purport to have researched every last piece of this. My point is really that I don't think anybody can categorically say this is the law at this stage, because I think there's ambiguities, and the fact that federal agencies have asserted that the law says one thing or the other does not mean that that is actually what the law is. And as you know, none of this really has been litigated, and the courts have not opined on the meaning of these statutes. So what I'm trying to say is I think there are certainly good arguments to counter arguments that the law means a certain thing. So let me start with CLIA. So as everybody knows, definition of CLIA is that a clinical laboratory its definition of a clinical laboratory under CLIA is a facility for the examination of specimens or materials derived from the human body for the purpose of providing information for diagnosis, prevention, or treatment of any disease or impairment of human beings. Then in the regulations of CLIA, 493.3 B, there is an exception for research laboratories that test human specimens but do not report patient-specific results for the diagnosis, prevention, treatment of any disease or impairment. So CLIA has informally interpreted that exception to exclude any circumstance in which a result goes back to a patient. But I don't really think that's what the law says, or at least not on its face. And so I don't think that that is the only possible interpretation. In fact, I think a more plain language interpretation is that if your intent in examining material is for diagnosis, prevention, or treatment of disease, then you are a clinical laboratory. If that is not your a priori intention, then you are not a clinical laboratory. And since research, by its definition, is an enterprise that is not intended to diagnose, treat, or mitigate, but to discover information. If you knew the answer, you knew the meaning of something, you would not be doing the research. I'd say that research really is not an enterprise that's covered by CLIA. Let me stop there and see if anybody has questions to that or wants to, attack me for that. Should I go on?
Charge on.
Yep. Okay. So with respect
hang on a
to
second,
FDA,
Steve. I'm sorry, Gail. Hang on a second, Steve.
Just picking up on something Susan Wolf said yesterday. Just your point, Gail, about the. This is Steve Jaffe, one of the committee members. Your point about research and sort of categorically not having that intent of diagnosis, treatment, et cetera. My own sort of reaction to that is there's a spectrum there where at one extreme it clearly doesn't, and then as it moves across the spectrum of translational research, it begins to. So for example, if the research test was intended to inform somebody's stratification on a clinical trial, or whether they were eligible for a clinical trial or something like that, it would be pretty darn close to decisions about diagnosis or treatment that, you're the lawyer, but would seem to me like you'd want to have the kind of safeguards that CLIA certification provides.
Sure. I mean, I think that that's correct. So there, I guess you are making a clinical judgment for the purpose of research. And yes, you certainly want that result validated. But I think I was answering maybe a different question, is whether all research laboratories, in order to give a result back to a patient, give a result back to a human subject, because I guess my point is that they're not patients if they are participating in a clinical trial. They are subjects. In order to return the result to them, does the research lab have to have CLIA? Whether it is a good idea for it to be CLIA, whether in order to ensure the validity of the information, sure. I mean, I would grant you that. Are there other ways besides CLIA to get there? I'm sure there are. my point is really that the law, when we say, well, you have to be CLIA and therefore end of story, I don't think the law is that clear on that point.
Very good, thanks.
Does that get at your question, Steve?
Yeah.
So moving on to FDA, I know that there is a belief by some, including some at the agency, that FDA's 21 CFR Part A12 medical device IDE regulations, investigational device exemption regulations, apply to basic research, such including sequencing of genes, where that information is going to go back to the patient. But again, being the contrarian that I am, my interpretation of these regulations is quite different, and I've had occasion to advise clients on this issue, and have come out in a very different place. And it goes down to, if you look, the statutory underpinnings of Part A12 are really light years removed from the research enterprise. So if you look at the Food and Drug Act, Cosmetic Act, it says basically you are prohibited from distributing in interstate commerce a medical device, and that has a regulatory definition, unless that has been subject to the proper marketing authorization to the extent it requires those marketing authorizations. So you make a new implantable heart in your or pacemaker in your basement, you want to sell it to your friend Joe down the street, you can't do that because it's not approved. But the statute makes an exception, which is an exception, grounded in sort of practicality. If researchers can't access investigational products to test them or to do tests with them, then how are they supposed to develop the data necessary for approval? So there's a carve-out, and that carve-out is for the conduct of research that is intended to develop a product for the market. And the whole context of Part A12 is that what are the circumstances under which you may ship an unapproved device in interstate commerce for the purpose of testing to develop the data necessary for market. And my understanding of most of the research that we're talking about is that is not the intent of the researchers at issue. Now, if it is, then that's a different story. But the context I'm most familiar with is when sequencing platforms are being used to do a whole genome sequence, and, for example, in the case of newborns, and to just try to understand what the impact of those genes and that information is. There is no activity there that is involved in the development of a medical product. And so, and if you look at, the scope applicability of Part A12, and I don't want to bore you by reciting it, the definitions just do not fit in the context of basic research. So really, and again, I'm very sensitive to the fact that there are those at FDA who have asserted jurisdiction here, but I think at least in some cases that we're talking about, there really isn't that jurisdiction, and there has been a confusion over the limits and scope of Part A12. So any questions for that one?
Not seeing any right now.
Okay. If you think of them later, go ahead. And then finally, HIPAA, and I really don't purport to be a HIPAA scholar or a HIPAA lawyer, but my understanding of the purpose of the HIPAA access rule and the whole context of the HIPAA rule is allowing patients access to their health information. If you look at a lot of the commentary surrounding the access rule, they talk about patients and providers and healthcare institutions, people wanting access to their medical record. I understand that some of the definitions may be broader than that, but I think context really does matter, and that, again, there's a danger in sort of interpreting words in isolation when the context of research and human subjects is not, there is no provider, and I think that's one of the key issues here. Researchers, some of them are MDs, some of them are not, but when they're acting in the research capacity, they are not clinical providers. And that is why we have these, I think one of the key reasons we have these clear divides between research and treatment, so that there's not that therapeutic misconception. So if you're not a provider and you're not a healthcare institution, then I would argue that the access rule is not really implicated. and I recognize that that may be more of a policy argument. I don't know, because I haven't looked back through the Federal Register, history of the development of the access rule, whether this issue of research results was even discussed. If somebody has in the room, that would be great. I suspect it's not, but since I haven't read it, I can speculate all I want. But I do think that it's clear that the context was just something very different from what we're discussing today. Okay, so I think I've gone through my legal assertions.
Great. Thank you very much. We're going to open it up for questions from the committee at this point. And I had Chester. Chester, are you still on that list?
I've been going back and forth on it, but I'll go ahead and ask the question. Ms. Wagner, this is for you. So, you said something that made me think back to a talk I gave not too long ago regarding the issue of social networking for patients, particularly families that had children with rare disorders. And there were some particularly striking recommendations from those groups regarding, don't be afraid to make mistakes, top-up and top-down approaches to these kinds of questions and moving forward. But as a parent of a child with a relatively rare disorder, can you give me a sense of your perspective on the concept that we hold so dear as clinicians, and that is do no harm? And I think that in part is why, a lot of your comments were very well taken, and the approach that we typically take when we think about such things. But as a parent in this situation, can you just elaborate on your feeling about this do no harm concept?
Sure. Microphone first. We actually did a study Parent Project did for the FDA regarding risk benefit. And we were kind of amazed at the amount of risk that parents are willing to take. And part of it is due to the diagnosis. So when the diagnosis is fatal and there is no treatment, the level of risk that you're willing to take to negate that end result is very high. So do no harm, obviously you don't want to make things worse, but what's worse than death? And that's really where I think the parents of a child in this disease and many rare diseases are very willing to take on a lot of risk to try to get a better result. Interesting you asked me that question. I'm waiting for an email right now to find out if I'm one of the speakers at an advisory committee meeting for a drug study on September 28th for a drug that my son's been in a trial for 13 years. And what I'm going to speak about, if I have the opportunity, is actually do no harm. And in this case, not approving the drug may be more harmful than approving the drug. So there's questions about efficacy, and I think Greg had some questions about another drug that was approved for Duchenne and the efficacy of the drug. But if the safety is there, if we know the drug is safe, what's more important, taking a chance on the efficacy or not taking a chance and possibly doing harm by doing nothing? And my thoughts to the FDA are going to be, my son his health is not good. He's 19 years old with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. He has a heart function of 36%. He's not in great shape. If you take him off a drug that he's been on for 13 years, are you doing more harm, and is the risk greater by not approving that drug than actually approving it? So, I think do no harm means different things to different people. And I think the diagnosis has a big impact on the amount of risk and how much risk a parent or a child is willing to take. So did I get at what you're looking for?
Steve?
I have two questions, but I'll just ask one, and then if there's time, come back to the second. This is actually for Gail. Gail, in your first presentation, you talked about when it comes time to think about how to return results from a legal point of view, you thought a lot could be dealt with, at least in part, by contracting. I'm not sure if you were talking about sort of formal contracting or metaphorical contracting between participants and investigators or whoever holds the data or the results. And I wanted to see if you could say more about your vision of what that might look like. Are we talking about some sort of agreement before the data or the results are shared, that there's some agreement that provides expectations and protections and that sort of thing on both sides of that deal? Or what do you have in mind when you talk about the contracting at that level? Yeah,
no, I was being more literal than metaphorical. in practice, a lot of this currently is done in the consent in terms of, but I've argued elsewhere that I think that the consent document should not be used for that purpose because that is a different context. But whether it's in the consent or a separate document there too, I'm really talking about laying out expectations, very clearly, saying, you're participating in research. We're going to derive this information. We don't know what it means. We are not doctors. We are not practicing medicine. You've indicated that you wish to receive these data. Here is what we can return. Here's what we will return. Here's what we won't return. Here's what you should know about it. Here's what we don't know about it. Really very granularly articulating the limitations and the expectations. And so I'm not saying those would be held up in court because you don't know until you're there. But I think it's helpful. Well, it's necessary so that there is a clear articulation at the outset, and you don't run into these. Well, I thought I was getting this, or I thought it meant this, or I think you can reduce a lot of those mismatched expectations and make sure the context is clear, which itself may reduce the likelihood that you will wind up in court and have the court interpret the contract. But then having it very clearly laid out gives you a better likelihood that a court would agree about what the parties to the contract agreed to at the time. And I think that there could be, professional guidelines that created a standard, not a standard of care, but a standard for what a good participant in research contract looks like. Here are the elements that you should include up front. We are returning results. We aren't returning results. We are returning results under this circumstance. Here's what we, et cetera, et cetera. I think all those elements could be thought through and drafted, and that would mitigate a lot of the concerns that we're talking about.
Thank you. Deborah?
So, Ellen, I very much appreciate, I recognized also in that first session how context matters a great deal when you're talking about return of results. So given that there is that context and there is an entire range of research types from discovery to clinical trials for drugs and other kinds of things, this is a question actually to all three, and Gail, you were kind of getting at this, I think. What mechanism could be used to help participants understand the difference between a research result and a clinical result, that research results are fundamentally different than what they are used to thinking about in a clinical context where there's a lot of trust? Is it a disclaimer? Is it a truly informed, and that's emphasizing the informedness, consent process? Is it, what tools could be used? Because that seems to be the fundamental issue in my mind, especially listening to the comments this morning.
I agree completely, and in many cases in a clinical trial, the lines are even more blurred because the investigator is often also the treating physician, especially in rare disease. So in almost all clinical trials that I can think of in the Duchenne world, the primary investigators, the PIs, are all treating physicians and probably the most prominent of the treating physicians in the disease. So the lines are very blurred when the investigator and the treating physician are the same person. So if it's a disclaimer, it has to be a very strong disclaimer. It probably has to be more than just a disclaimer, probably a longer I think it was John that talked earlier about consent and using pictures and using more than one appointment to work on the consent. And that makes a lot of sense to me. Logistically, more than one appointment doesn't work because people are already traveling for clinical trials. They don't need to travel for consent appointments as well. But I do think that a lot of the education is going to fall on the primary investigator, particularly if the primary investigator is also the treating physician, to be very clear about what the differences are. But I think that's a good question.
Could you clarify from your question, Deborah? Are you asking about returning results that don't meet clinical testing standards?
Yes, so basically return of research results that were not performed in a laboratory that is CLIA accredited. I don't think there's as much controversy about returning results that are produced in a CLIA laboratory. So yes, that is, and that's a good clarification, because research laboratories may or may not be CLIA accredited.
Right. So then, I mean, my proposal in my opening comments was suggested at bifurcating those things, and non-clinically validated results should be, to the extent possible, separated from that sort of interpretive clinical standard that we try to practice. And if a participant wants to pull those data, we allow that and accept that and support that, and we make it clear to them, you are making a demand, a request on the system, which we will honor, and that is separate from anything we do clinically or validate or assure or anything. And to be blunt, you're on your own.
How do you make sure they understand that? That's my question. What mechanisms can be used to really mitigate the risk that a research result will be interpreted as a clinical result by the research participant?
Well, that's a really hard question. Unfortunately,
I guess I would. Sorry.
Well, and Paul may
Can I
have
jump in
something
here
to
for a
say
second?
about this too. Paul, are you interested in commenting on that as well, or?
So, I mean, in the context of HIV, and I think breast cancer as well, you know, we've done peer-based scientific literacy, and so you start with the basics about a disease and the way HIV works, the immune system works, but you end up talking about research, and these issues do come up. Now, it's been able to be funded under the Ryan White Care Act, so not the NIH, and I'm wondering if a peer-based system would work in Duchenne's, for instance, where it's not, the informed consent process is not the place for this. It's not going to, I mean, I got consented in 10 minutes with a 10-page form, which I couldn't finish reading. So it's not going to happen in that consent process, but could it happen in a peer-based way where you had some sort of curriculum like Fran does for her members, many HIV groups do for their members? Could that be a model for getting to a place where people understand the distinction between a clinical test and a research test?
Well, yeah, but then I get to the question of vulnerable populations. And how do we ensure that we don't break the trust that is needed to even engage vulnerable populations, and yet have them understand that if they have a research result or are requesting one or getting one, that that's not a clinical result?
Does it go back to once the patient has the research result, there isn't much they can do with the result on their own. So at that point, they have to reach out to some sort of medical professional. I mean, short of ordering medication on the internet, and it happens all the time. I mean, that is absolutely a possibility. But short of doing that, to receive therapeutic care based on that research result, they have to bring that research result somewhere. And is there a safeguard already built into the system that looks at that research result, whoever that medical professional is, and says, well, this is all fine and good, but we need to verify this? And I'm asking that question, is that already built in?
You know, Deborah, I think this is where the Silicon Valley and the sort of the medical establishment really come to loggerheads. And I think what we have to understand is this concept of, which is where you're going, is free the data, right? And I think when you free the data, you must accept that you are losing all control of all of the downstream implications. You can't anticipate the downstream reactions. You can't prevent the downstream problems. You have no ability to adequately inform people about what the potential consequences could be of misusing those free data. You just have to let it go. And I think that is the inescapable truth of what happens when you just open the floodgates. And I think there are strong arguments for allowing participants to have their primary data, and we all just have to accept that you completely lose control.
Including ethicists accepting that?
And
sorry.
lawyers. And you just, that's...
No, not at all. Paul, were you interested in pitching in on this question?
Yeah, I also had a question for the panel, but I'll hold that until I'm my place in the queue. But yeah, so to respond to Deborah's question, I don't think you can ensure, you can't guarantee that people are really going to understand the distinction between research results and ordinary validated clinical results. But you can increase the likelihood of that with some targeted education that attempts to explain to them the difference between research and ordinary clinical care and the inherent uncertainty that's part of research. So let me say two brief things about that. One is we have a paper in press now at PLOS 1, which is really the first demonstration of a systematic effort to undercut therapeutic misconception by teaching people something about scientific methodology in a simple web-based format with, slides and voiceover, and it seems to be effective not in eliminating therapeutic misconception, but in reducing substantially the tendency for people to think in those ways. However, note that this is now one more element of education that we'd be loading into an already education-intense process. What's the study about? What are the potential results? What are the implications of your personal results? So we're really asking people to learn a lot in order to deal with this in a reasonable way. That being said, it may well be possible to do, or at least do in a substantial way.
Can I jump in here?
Hang on, Wiley wanted to speak to this issue directly.
Yeah, I wanted to speak to this point. Just to echo, I think, comments that we've heard throughout the meeting. Uncertainty exists. People deal with uncertainty. It's a reality. But I also want to, and we shouldn't get too hung up on it, but I also want to build on what Paul just said to point out, if you move away from the research space and just look at the clinical space, patients frequently have the experience of getting an initial result that is raised as a question but is not definitive and requires follow-up. This is a normal daily part of clinical practice. And I think it gives us a guide to how to communicate the research grade result. It's really, and building on the kinds of things we heard from Sage Bionetworks about using pictures and using simple explanations, I actually think the concept that there's something here, it raises a question, it doesn't mean for sure, is something people are accustomed to. It's very doable.
Okay, I've got Steve, maybe Greg on the list, not on the list. Amy McGuire has sent in a comment, and then I think back to Paul then. And let me say we theoretically have 2 minutes, but as of an hour ago, we did not have members of the public who had signed up for comment during our next half hour. So if folks are, unless that situation's changed quite a bit, I'm going to allow this session to continue for at least another 10 minutes or so. Okay.
Thanks.
Steve.
So, question for anybody who wants to pick it up. One of the panels yesterday was people talking about the clinical systems, the clinical side of this. If results get returned from research context, how does the clinical health systems, clinicians, et cetera, have to deal with those results? And the message that I heard there was a combination of, there are real challenges here, we're not reimbursed for it, we're not trained for it, we don't have the time for it, and the clinical system really hasn't to date agreed to accept the responsibility to deal with results that come out of research context. And then with Geisinger perhaps being the best example, if you really set up a very robust system to do this, you can do it, but you got to be thinking prospectively. And of course, that was within a system, which not everything happens within a system. So I'd be just very interested from reflections from all of you on how we should think about the burden that a free the data approach, if I can use Les's term, imposes or might impose on the clinical systems that may have to deal with some of the repercussions or questions that come up.
Well, I think there's two questions. From what I understood, if you're asking the clinician to relay the data, that's not a reimbursable expense. If the data is relayed in the research arena and the patient comes to their physician with this data and says, please help me interpret it, well, now they've made an appointment and entered the office, and I would assume that is a reimbursable expense because now they're talking about a particular issue. So I think it's kind of two questions.
I think when I think about what you're asking, Steve, I think back to the word that I kind of like from 45 CFR 46. They use that word practicability fairly often. And I think that pertains here, and your question does get to that. I think if a researcher identifies a novel chemical biomarker for a disease for which a clinical assay doesn't exist, and the clinical validity of that is as yet unproven but likely, and the clinical utility of using that to change care is entirely unknown, that's a huge amount of work, and i.e. money, that would need to be done to translate that into clinical reality. And one could argue that that is an amount of resources that is disproportionate to the potential benefit and the burden on the system. Someone made the point yesterday, ironically, that genomics is kind of one of the easier targets. And because the validation is straightforward and interpreting variants in general is a doable thing, and therefore your practicability there is very, it could be potentially very reasonable. So I think what I was suggesting in my opening remarks is we need a peer review IRB DSMB kind of a hybrid model to evaluate your question and make a determination as to whether that is practicable or not.
All right, here's a question from Amy McGuire. As Gail very eloquently pointed out, the discussion over the past 2 days reflects a real shift from some of the core principles reflected in the Belmont report and work by the National Commission, which have been the foundation of our ethical and policy frameworks for the past 40 years, which went to great lengths to distinguish research from clinical care, with the primary goal of research being to generate generalizable knowledge and not to primarily provide benefit to the participant, in an effort to avoid the therapeutic misconception. Is this shift ethically justifiable? On what basis, and what implications does it have for how we think about the researcher-participant relationship more broadly? How about that in a minute or two? Yeah.
I'm not an ethicist.
I am certainly not an ethicist.
Well, I think, Suzanne, do you want to have a relevant comment here?
Yeah, I'm I'm definitely not an ethicist, but I haven't heard, my perception is that we're not shifting away from the Belmont principles, that we are, in some of the things, it may be rebalancing the principles. And I think one of the things that's I think it's both emphasizing autonomy in a different way that might not have been emphasized in some of the previous aspects. And also, I think it's a broadening of the notion of beneficence. So for me, I haven't felt like we were absolutely not throwing these out. I've thought about this a lot and written about it in the context of big data. And in terms of beneficence, we do need to think about scientific rigor, and that relates very well to many of the things we're talking about here. So I kind of feel that we're not generating new principles, but we're paying careful attention to them, but broadening the context, and perhaps thinking about emphasizing several of the principles in different ways that they've been done in the past. But I'm not an ethicist. That's just how I've been thinking about this in my own head.
That was a very good imitation of an ethicist. That was great. That was great. Sure.
I'm not really an ethicist either. I just play one at Penn. But I just want to remind all of us that sort of core distinction between research and treatment in the Belmont report was really there for one purpose within the report, which is to help demarcate what sorts of things require IRB or equivalent review. It's taken on a sort of larger life of its own since then for sort of, many good reasons. But the original purpose in the report was really, when do we actually have to invoke an IRB?
Well, am I on mute, or can people hear
No,
me?
we can hear you. Go ahead, Gail.
Oh, great. Yeah, I'm not sure I agree with that, but certainly even if that was the intent in that report, much of the regulations since then have been explicitly to ensure that people who participate in research don't misunderstand what their role is and what their role is not. I mean, if you look at FDA's, informed consent regulations, and I've written a lot of consent documents for them, for the clinical trials, you have to say, I understand this will not benefit me. This may not benefit me, but the purpose is to determine whether or not XYZ therapy will treat XYZ disease. And similarly, the common rule also, as part of informed consent, you need to explain that this is research. It is not for your clinical benefit. You may incidentally benefit. So I think we should explicitly acknowledge that we are blurring lines, and there may be good reasons for it. I'm not sure who was speaking, but I think you're right that we may want to reassess the core principles and how we weight them, but we should be explicit about the fact that we are raising by blurring the lines, potentially undoing some of the safeguards which were intended, I think, to make sure that researchers know that the investigator is not acting in their interest. I'm not saying they're acting against their interest, but their primary goal, the primary objective is not to benefit that subject, but to discover to answer a question, a research question, which may indirectly help them, may not help them. I'm not saying we shouldn't blur those lines. We shouldn't take on more risk about, creating a therapeutic misconception, but we should do it very explicitly. Say, yes, we understand that, and we think it's justified because of these other benefits, because the research context has changed, and we all know the history of the common rule, the genesis of the Belmont report was abuses, and maybe that's not the best way to make policy. And so our research enterprise has changed. The research participants have changed, and we may want to do that, but I think we should at least be aware that that's what we're doing and address it and sort of own it. I also want to comment that I think it's very hard to make blanket rules given, and I'm sure people have said this yesterday, very hard to make one-size-fits-all rules when research is so varied. I think the clinical research context, for drug development and drug discovery is very different from the researcher who's trying to find a new biomarker or understand the role of a gene. And I think the expectations of participants may be very different, and how we treat them may be different. So I think breaking this down into sort of alternative scenarios of research or categories of research might help create, develop guidelines that are more context specific.
That's good. And I guess I would say from my perspective too, a task of the committee is to try to evaluate those circumstances in which there might be a trade-off between generalizable knowledge and the primary research mission and beneficence and promoting autonomy, et cetera. And when there is a trade-off, we ought to be very careful about undermining the research enterprise. When there's not a trade-off and we can promote those other values without threatening scientific enterprise, then that's probably a win-win circumstance. Okay, we have a couple more minutes, and I have Paul and Greg and Chester.
So I can't resist just weighing in very briefly on this last exchange to say that although I'm as much an advocate as anybody of recognizing the difference between treatment and research, all research is in fact not the same in terms of its distinctiveness from treatment. There is research that is more like ordinary treatment, although it nonetheless retains a research goal, and research that is not at all like ordinary treatment, and we need to help people recognize not just that research isn't treatment, but that research differs from treatment, but it differs in different ways depending on the details of the study. So let me just throw that in. But the question I wanted to pose for the panel, which actually is not unrelated to what Gail just finished with, goes back to a comment that was made in the closing panel yesterday. And this may have been what Ellen was referring to when she said the tone changed over the course of the day. So in particular, Heather Pierce, who was representing AAMC, made a suggestion that whatever we come up with, we ought to endorse a permissive rather than a mandatory approach with regard to return of results. That is, recognizing that there are huge differences in the capability of investigators and systems to return data, and big differences in the type of data they will have. Although we might want to recognize the advantages of returning data when that's possible, essentially, I think she was arguing for an investigator gets to opt out approach. And I'm just wondering how our panel would respond to that as a potential way of going with this issue.
I think if the investigator gets to opt out, there's no point in moving forward. What investigator would opt in? I think that's a very dangerous approach. Maybe there's a specific reason on a specific study, although I can't envision why any one study would be any more dangerous or difficult to release the results than any other study.
So if I can, let me just push back for a second on that to get your response. It could be said that to the extent that people like you have views such as the ones you've endorsed and your colleagues on your panel had endorsed yesterday with regard to the value to them as individuals in having access to their own data, that people will vote with their feet. And that to the extent that investigators can offer return of data, that then becomes an incentive and they have an easier time recruiting participants, and the ones who don't, simply have a harder time, and the field, generally moves in that direction, except when it's just infeasible for them to do so. How would you respond to that?
Well, That might be true in larger disease states. That's absolutely not the case in a rare disease. In a rare disease, there's not enough patient subjects to begin with. And there's not a lot of opportunity there. It's not like I can choose from 25 studies in which one do I want to enter this week. There's one particular therapy for the disease that my son is involved with, and that's the study I want to be in. And if that investigator decides he's going to opt out and not give my information, now I'm stuck between I either don't get my information and I don't get a potential therapy, or I move ahead for the therapy and say, be damned the information, because the investigator has me between a rock and a hard place. So I think in breast cancer, maybe that works, but certainly that model doesn't work in the rare disease community. We talked yesterday a little bit about power and where does the power belong. And in that scenario, the investigator or the researcher has all the power. And I think there has to be a balance.
I think, Paul, my response to your question is I think there's a big difference between participant pull and researcher push. And in participant pull, I think, to my understanding at least, that's primarily a right that participants have to access to data, in which case the answer to your question is no, the researcher has no veto over that, is my take on that in general. But I think researcher push is a very different thing, because when I think of a researcher pushing data out to participants, then that researcher owns some of the responsibility for the consequences of pushing that data out. And therefore, there's responsibility, and that then brings, I think, the IRB into the question of guiding the researcher and coming to an agreement about what is appropriate and what is not appropriate to push out, and what safeguards and downstream support a researcher owes to the participants if they are going to push that set of data out to them. So I think of those in very different things, and I think when we then bump into the potential individual clinical utility of research results, then I think in general my view is we are very close to, if not always at, the clinical testing standard for such results. In experimental situations, and we have done this, we have pushed out as an experiment uncertain data to participants to test the question of how disruptive or confusing or whatever such uncertain data might be. That's a valid experiment to do, but our IRB was very cautious about that and wanted to ensure that there were backstops behind that to deal with the potential confusion and adverse consequences of that, because we owned the responsibility, because that was a push. Does that answer your question?
Can I ask for a clarification, Les, because you just made the statement participant pull is controlled by the researcher.
No.
Oh, that's what I heard you say.
I'm sorry. I said it was not under the control of the researcher. That is my understanding is that's the legal right when a participant requests the primary data. That's theirs.
Thank you. I misunderstood.
I'm sorry if I misspoke. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to need to wrap up fairly soon, and I have three more questions. Greg, Chester, and Wiley.
So we keep coming around to the resource issue, and it's agitating a lot of people in this room because they're thinking it's coming out of their NIH grant. But in the context of HIV, 15 years ago they said we can't give ARVs in the developing world. It's too complex, it's too difficult, you need specialized doctors to do this. What do you think about the idea of task shifting, which is what happened in this context, where you had to use community health workers or nurses to deliver care? Can you deliver it? If there's a way to get people to understand uncertainty and the difference between a research result and a clinical result, does it have to be done by a researcher, by a physician, by a nurse? Or can this, in order to scale, can we do it at a community health worker level, an expert patient level? Because I don't see a way to do it across the board in any other way.
It's a great question, and it is, as you say, fundamentally a resource question. And how much of the research enterprise resources do you want to use to accomplish what you're trying to accomplish, whether that's direct activity by that research entity, whether it is passed on to a secondary entity such as a community health center through a liaison with that community health center. But and there's lots of creative ways to do that. And frankly, a lot of people's resistance to doing what you are advocating is just, I don't want to do it, so I'm going to say it's impossible. Right? And so we have to be honest about that. But irrespective of that, these creative and different ways of doing things and pushing things out through platform, all of that still does require resources. It's inescapable, and it's always a question of how much.
Chester.
Oh, yes, this is just a quick comment and follow-up to Amy's original question about the Belmont report. One important concept there as well is justice, and we've discussed several times the issue of disparity, and so I happen to have this on my laptop. Who ought to receive the benefits of research and bear its burden? This is a question of justice in the sense of fairness in distribution, which I think is one concept that we will probably need to address, and as you said, or others, own this question, right? And perhaps within the report, discuss this within the context of Belmont and how fundamentally our recommendations might interact with that. That's it.
Sorry, yeah, I think it's a critical thing, and I wanted to include earlier in the comments, but I dropped it out, the notion of, and this has happened to me more than once, and I always find it very disturbing, is I get referrals of research participants where the counselor or geneticist is sending me a patient for my study, and they're very straightforward about it. The reason why I'm sending them to you is because you do research testing for free. This patient needs a clinical test, and there is no third-party payer or resources to give them that. And I find it very disturbing. So we have to think hard about that because it is absolutely happening, and I think the worst possible thing we could do in some naive notion of it's always great to share data and data should always be out there is that we create a tiered system where affluent patients get clinical testing and poor patients get research testing to a lower standard, and that's just totally unacceptable.
Wiley.
This question is a very directed question to Gail, and it is seeking to clarify a point that we've gone back and forth about, or really just to confirm, I think, what Gail has told us. I am referring to a fairly prominent editorial that was published in JAMA Internal Medicine last March or so, authored by Bernard Lowe and Deborah Grady. It was in reference to a study of anemia and its relationship to testosterone level. And one of the things that came out when the study report was reviewed was the fact that participants who had mild levels of anemia had not been informed of that. So participants in the study were found to have mild levels of anemia, and the study protocol did not involve people being told that. And this editorial takes strong exception to that. But the quote I want to give you is, the argument is that clinical researchers have, quote, an ethical and legal responsibility, unquote, to, again, quote, disclose to participants valid individual results that would lead to changes in their clinical care, unquote. So this editorial is making a statement that there is both an ethical duty to disclose such results and a legal duty to do so. Again, this question is directed to Gail. I think you just told us there is no such legal duty, so I just wanted to clarify that. The reference that is cited in this editorial is actually a SACCARP document. So, Gail, could you comment on the legal responsibility?
Sure, and I'm a bit at a disadvantage, and I haven't looked at the reference. I am not, when you say, is there a legal duty, I have to unpack that and say, is there any statute that says you must do this? Is there any federal or state regulation that says you must do this? And has any case law said you must do this? I don't purport to have scoured the waterfront, but I am not aware of any statute, regulation, or case law that says a researcher must return clinical findings in the context of clinical research. I'm not going to touch the question of whether there's an ethical obligation because, I'm also not an ethicist and try not to play one on TV. I could see reasonable people debating that and coming out saying, yes, there is. That said, were this to come to a court and the patient said, the subject said, well, I wasn't told that I have mild anemia and I had the following adverse effects, a court would have to say, well, was there a duty of care and was it breached and was there harm? The standard negligence litany. I'm skeptical that in that context, as long as there was a clear consent document that said, you're participating in research, it may not benefit you. We may or may, we are, particularly if the consent document said, we're not giving you back information, or even if it didn't say that, there was expert testimony to the effect that it is not standard in the research context to give that clinical information. I'm skeptical that a court would find that researcher had a duty. But it does point to, so I guess the short answer is no, I'm not aware of a legal duty to return clinically relevant results. I do think it would be good if that was made clearer in consent documents so there isn't a misconception. And that doesn't mean that one shouldn't do it if depending on the circumstance.
Thank you.
Let me thank our panel members. Gail, Leslie, and Ellen, thank you so much for your comments. I think this was an excellent session.
Well, thanks for including me in.
Yes, thanks again. And any comments you'd like to submit to the committee in written form, be more than welcome. All right, do we have anyone signed up for public comment at this point? Looks like no, formally, and I think what we had hoped to do was just open the floor for anybody who might be participating in the meeting who wish to, at this point, not ask questions to the panel, but make a statement. And we're asking folks to do so in about a 3-minute period of time. And the floor is now open for any members of the public who wish to comment.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This has been a very informative couple of days. I have 2 comments I'd like to share and have you contemplate. One would be, I think the blurring that we've been talking about between research and clinical is really important. And I'm in a lot of worlds that's working on learning health system models. And so I think one of the things that patients tell us, and certainly people who go to get care, they seem to have the misunderstanding that the care that they're receiving somehow informs our knowledge as we go forward. And for the most part, we know that doesn't necessarily always happen. But conversely, they go into research for varieties of reasons, some of which is to generalize the knowledge that gets gained, but a lot of times it's to understand something more about themselves if they can. So I think it might be worthwhile to really push the boundaries on this some and start to think about ways of saying, if we are looking at new types of data that has new potentials that didn't exist at the time of some of the the rules and the regulations that we're working with were written, then maybe it's time for us to think about how we could mitigate the opportunity or take advantage of the opportunities we have and mitigate the risks at the same time. So I would just encourage you to think about that, and that the blurring will continue to get more blurred, not more clear. The other thing I'd like to suggest, and I'm actually doing a fair amount of work with the FDA right now and their digital health team, and I don't know whether you're familiar with it, but I'm just going to throw it out there. One of the things that they've been working on in terms of software as a medical device, which we ultimately will be starting to look at in terms of a lot of this data getting to into systems that actually produce something from an algorithm. And so those algorithms ultimately are going to have to be regulated. But one of the things that they've come up with, which I'm wondering, given the variability across institutions on their capacity to deliver well on return of results, that maybe there might be some way of thinking about what they're doing with this is a pre-cert type of analysis. Is this institution, do they demonstrate the capacity to deliver well on return of results, and what are the criteria to do that? And it might just be a way of being able to sort of mitigate again that concern that there are going to be some that are doing it well and some that aren't. And for those that don't rise to the level of the capacity that might be needed, maybe they have the opportunity to outsource some of that return of results to some other entity that does. So I'm just trying to ask you to push the envelope a little bit on thinking about ways of harmonizing between FDA, OCR, and CMS on ways of being able to say if return of results is now something that we're all going to be expecting to do, and participants are going to join studies that actually do that well or want to join studies that do that well, then maybe what the committee could do would be to think about what does it look like when it's done well, and then ask institutions to have the analysis or assessment of their capabilities to be able to deliver on that. So.
Thank you. Other comments? Susan?
Thank you. Wiley, on the question of whether there's a legal duty, I would urge you all to look at Grimes and to look at it through this lens. I also think, you know, Grimes is 2001, as I recall. There's a lot of water under the bridge since then. You got to talk also to the neuroimaging people who've been at this a lot longer than the genetics and genomics people. And the other, if you ask them, I would predict, at this point, is there a professional standard that might indeed be enforced in a court of law? I think you would hear a clear answer to that question. So to me, that reinforces the need to get, as I argued yesterday, beyond the sphere of genetics and genomics and look more broadly. I think there is an evolving standard. When courts look at negligence cases, whether ordinary negligence or professional negligence, they look at what the relevant standard is, particularly if it's professional negligence. So I think we do have an emerging legal standard. That doesn't mean that in every case an investigator has to return, but it means in a constellation of factors may create a legal duty.
Could I, that's very helpful. And bringing our attention to the Grimes case is extremely helpful. What I think I'm hearing you say is there may be an emerging legal duty that's perhaps based most strongly on professional standards, and that to the extent that that exists, it's probably going to be influenced by contextual factors that include the nature of the result and the implications of that result for the participants' well-being. Is there things of that sort?
Yeah, absolutely right. Because if you look at a court of law, as Gail was suggesting, they're going to say, is there a duty? Was it breached? Was it causative of harm, compensable, and damages? You look at a case like Grimes, where you've got kid lead levels. This kid is in danger. You got to sound the alarm. So it's a strong case.
Thank you. And I think it'd be helpful for the committee probably to get a brief description of the Grimes case for our review. I know there was quite a bit of literature on this 15 years ago, and so I think bringing that forward to committee would be helpful. Other comments? All right, seeing none, I want to thank everybody who's participated for the last day and a half, committee members and all members of the public who are here to help us think about these issues, and stay tuned to see how our process works out over the next 6 to 9 months. So we'll now be going into closed session. So thanks again.